We are looking at a scenario that contradicts basic math. The US real estate market recently recorded its lowest number of sales since 1995. That means we have fewer properties changing hands today than we've seen in 3 decades. Yet somehow, property values are hovering right near their all-time peaks. You have a massive drop in buyers, but prices keep climbing. Under normal economic conditions, these two forces naturally balance each other out. It is the fundamental law of supply and demand that we all picked up in middle school. But right now, the entire system is paralyzed. Valuations are completely detached from reality. We have even reached the point where the typical first-time home buyer is 40 years old. If you have been out there trying to purchase a place lately, you can feel that something is fundamentally broken beneath the surface. You just might not know exactly what is causing it. Today, we are going to dive into the exact reality that real estate agents, mortgage brokers, and mainstream financial outlets would honestly rather keep quiet. We are going to break down precisely how this market got cornered, mapping out every single domino that fell using hard data. This way, when you decide to make your next financial move, you are doing it with complete clarity. Let's look at the real math behind this massive structural freeze. Right now, the median price for an existing home sits at roughly $418,000. If we look back to 2019, just 7 years ago, that figure was $272,000. That is a staggering 46% explosion in value. We are not talking about luxury markets like Manhattan or Palo Alto here. This is the national median, the absolute middle ground of the entire country. On top of that, mortgage rates are hovering right around 6.5%. That might not sound like a crisis on the surface, until you realize that back in January 2021, buyers were securing 30-year fixed mortgages at just 2.65%. That is an entirely different economic universe. Let's look at what that interest rate gap actually looks like in your bank account. Imagine a typical house listed for $450,000. You put 20% down, leaving you with a $360,000 loan. If you locked in that 2.65% rate a few years ago, your monthly payment would sit at roughly $1,450. But at today's 6.5% rate, that exact same mortgage skyrockets to about $2,275 every single month. You are suddenly paying $825 more out of pocket every month for the next 3 decades. And keep in mind, this is for the exact same property. You get the same outdated kitchen, the exact same mediocre school district, and a backyard barely bigger than a driveway. Plus, you are shelling out a massive premium for the asset itself compared to just a few years ago. You are basically getting squeezed on the borrowing costs while drastically overpaying for the house at the very same time. None of this is just an unfortunate coincidence. It is the direct result of a chain reaction that started 5 years ago. Let's rewind to 2020. The global economy was essentially in freefall, and the Federal Reserve hit the panic button. They aggressively slashed interest rates down to zero. On top of that, they started injecting $120 billion into bonds and mortgage-backed securities every single month. It was like trying to put out a small fire by flooding the entire neighborhood with cash. They saturated the financial system with unprecedented amounts of liquidity, completely changing the economic landscape. Because of that massive intervention, by January 2021, the 30-year fixed mortgage plummeted to 2.65%. That was the cheapest borrowing cost recorded since 1971. Anyone who had been casually browsing real estate apps suddenly realized their purchasing power had essentially doubled overnight, so a massive wave of buying began. But cheap debt was only one piece of the puzzle. The way we actually lived fundamentally changed. Your tiny downtown apartment was suddenly your office, your gym, and your entire world. With remote work surging from under 6% to over 18% in the blink of an eye, millions of workers realized there was no point paying premium rent for a shoebox when they didn't have to commute to a desk anymore. So a massive migration kicked off. Hundreds of thousands of households packed up and left major urban centers like Manhattan, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Chicago. Where did they go? They flooded into cities like Austin, Phoenix, Boise, Nashville, and Tampa. These were markets that already had somewhat limited housing inventory. Suddenly, you had a stampede of out-of-state remote workers arriving with fat savings accounts, pre-approved loans, and a desperate desire for a house with a dedicated home office and an actual backyard. It was the absolute perfect storm of cheap money and skyrocketing demand, slamming into a tight supply of homes. The inevitable result was an absolute explosion in property values. Between March 2020 and March 2022, national home prices skyrocketed by 37%. To put that into perspective, that is the kind of growth you normally expect to see over an entire decade, crammed into just 2 years. Local markets were even wilder. Austin surged by 61%, Phoenix shot up 59%, and Boise jumped 53%. At the height of this frenzy, thousands of normal everyday houses were selling for $100,000 over their asking prices. If you managed to secure a property during that specific window, you made a brilliant financial move. But let's be honest, that wasn't strategic genius. That was pure, unadulterated luck with timing. And for everyone who missed that window, the nightmare was just beginning. By the middle of 2022, inflation had surged to 9.1%, hitting a 40-year peak. In response, the Federal Reserve pulled the emergency brake. They hiked interest rates with historic aggression, pushing them up 11 times in just 16 months, taking the baseline from a near 0.25% all the way to 5.50%. This was the fastest tightening cycle we had seen in 4 decades, and it dragged mortgage rates up with it in brutal fashion. By October 2023, the 30-year rate had spiked to 7.79%, the absolute highest since the year 2000. So suddenly, those exact same homes people were fighting over and overpaying for just months prior now carried a catastrophic borrowing cost. If you were taking out a $300,000 mortgage at that 7.79% peak, your monthly payment was over $1,000 more than it would have been at the pandemic lows. You are literally paying hundreds of thousands of dollars more over the lifespan of the loan for the exact same property. That intense mathematical squeeze completely devastated buyer demand. To comfortably afford a median-priced home at today's roughly 6.5% rate, a household needs to pull in well over $100,000 a year. Yet, the official median household income in the US sits right at $83,700. That means the typical American family is structurally priced out of the typical American home by tens of thousands of dollars. Millions of potential buyers were instantly erased from the market. So, demand collapsed. But here is the bizarre twist that defines our current crisis. Prices did not crash because supply collapsed at the exact same time. The reason is a phenomenon known as the lock-in effect. Today, around 51% of all active US mortgages are locked in at an interest rate below 4%, and a staggering 20% are under 3%. Those ultra-cheap loans are essentially a financial artifact that no longer exists in the wild. If you own one of those 3% mortgages, selling your house doesn't just mean packing up boxes. It means voluntarily destroying the cheapest debt you will ever hold in your lifetime. Federal Reserve data shows that giving up that old rate for a modern one carries an average financial penalty of over $65,000. That is a massive exit fee just for wanting a new zip code. So rationally, people are refusing to move. They are staying in homes they have outgrown strictly because a spreadsheet tells them to. This dynamic has kept active housing inventory massively suppressed, effectively paralyzing the market. It is like an engine that has completely seized up. Real quick before we continue, if this breakdown is helping you make sense of the market, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe to Kyle Invests. Also, I am curious, what interest rate would it actually take for you to consider buying or selling right now? Drop your magic number in the comments below. To really grasp who is taking the heaviest hit, let's look at a hypothetical buyer named Chloe. She is in her early 30s, earns a solid $80,000 a year, has zero credit card debt, an excellent credit score, and managed to save up $40,000 for a down payment. On paper, Chloe is the exact demographic the housing market was built for. But look at the math. The median home in her area is $400,000. If she puts down her 10%, she needs a $360,000 loan. At a 6.5% interest rate, her basic mortgage payment is roughly $2,275. Add in property taxes, insurance, and basic maintenance, and her total housing cost hits $3,000 a month. Chloe's take-home pay is around $5,000 a month, meaning housing would devour 60% of her entire net income. She would have barely anything left over for groceries, transportation, or living a normal life. The system simply rejects her, not because of bad financial habits, but because the numbers are structurally stacked against her. Right now, folks purchasing their very first home account for a mere 21% of total sales. That is the absolute lowest level recorded in 44 years of tracking. Historically, that number should be sitting closer to 40%. Even wilder, the typical age for a first-time buyer has been pushed all the way up to 40 years old. Back in the early 90s, it was just 28. By delaying that purchase by over a decade, you are essentially missing out on roughly $150,000 in lifetime wealth accumulation because you weren't building equity during those critical years. Meanwhile, baby boomers now represent 42% of the entire buyer pool, and a massive chunk of them are paying straight cash. They are cashing out of properties they bought back in 1998 for maybe $200,000, which are now magically worth $700,000. So, you have a young professional armed with a modest savings account trying to win a bidding war against someone carrying a metaphorical duffel bag full of equity. The fallout from this dynamic is completely reshaping society. A massive 84% of Gen Z hopefuls are actively putting off major life events simply because of the brutal cost of housing. We are talking about 29% delaying having kids and 18% pushing back marriage. A shocking 22% of millennials have just thrown in the towel on homeownership altogether. But here is the critical piece of the puzzle that the media rarely highlights. This massive inventory shortage didn't just magically appear during the 2020 chaos. It is actually the result of 15 solid years of chronic underbuilding following the 2008 financial crash. Today, the United States is missing anywhere between 3.5 and 4.5 million housing units. We basically spent a decade and a half neglecting to build the very foundation of the American middle class. After the economy collapsed in 2008, construction companies hit the brakes hard. Throughout the entire 2010s, they only built around 990,000 homes a year, falling way short of the historical norm of 1.5 million. And what they did manage to build was heavily skewed toward luxury properties, because that is exactly where the profit margins were thickest. The classic starter home, those modest properties under 1,400 square feet, has practically gone extinct. In the 1970s, developers were cranking out over 400,000 of those every single year. By 2020, that number plummeted to just 65,000. That is an 80% wipeout of the exact product designed to help working-class families get a foothold in the market. Throw in recent supply chain chaos and massive tariffs, with steel and aluminum costs up 50%, and developers are forced to tack on an extra $10,000 to $17,500 just to construct a new house. The supply side of this equation is completely shattered. Whenever this topic comes up, someone inevitably asks the big question: are we heading for another 2008 crash? The short answer is absolutely not. The underlying mechanics of today's market are entirely different. Back in 2006, toxic subprime mortgages made up about 20% of the market. People were getting handed loans with zero proof of income. Today, subprime lending sits at a tiny 4%, and the median credit score for a new loan is 758, which is phenomenally high. More importantly, in 2009, a terrifying 26% of all mortgaged homes were completely underwater, triggering a tsunami of foreclosures. Today, only 2.2% of homes are upside down. American homeowners are currently sitting on a jaw-dropping $35.8 trillion in collective equity. The 2008 crisis was built on terrible loans and imaginary valuations. Today, the loans are rock solid, the buyers are highly qualified, and the equity is very real. This isn't a fragile bubble ready to pop. It is a fortress that has bolted its doors shut. So, technically, this isn't a fragile environment. Instead, it is a deeply expensive, completely paralyzed market that is just painfully grinding sideways. It is constantly absorbing more of your paycheck while we all wait for time to fix what government policy simply cannot. Everyone is sitting around hoping for a massive drop in mortgage rates, and sure, that would definitely help. While current projections show rates might settle around 5.7% to 6.1% soon, surveys indicate about 40% of current homeowners will refuse to sell until rates drop below 5%. We are not hitting that target anytime soon. But the lock-in effect does naturally slowly fade away, because life happens. People retire, have kids, change jobs, or relocate. In fact, the total share of active mortgages sitting under 4% has already decreased from a massive peak of 65% down to roughly 50% today. That slow trickle of life events is the most realistic way this market eventually unfreezes. But we are looking at a grueling 5 to 10 year timeline. Here is the wild twist almost nobody mentions. If rates actually did plunge to 5% tomorrow, it could temporarily make the housing crisis much worse. Millions of sideline buyers would immediately swarm the market, violently colliding with a 3.5 million home deficit that took a decade to create. Prices would absolutely skyrocket all over again. The most realistic outcome is honestly just boring. We are facing a slow, multi-year correction where property values basically flatline while everyday incomes try to gradually catch up. We won't see a dramatic crash and we won't see instant relief. Just a long, grinding adjustment period filled with incredibly tough personal choices. If you are in your 20s or 30s right now, you are trying to survive the most dysfunctional real estate environment since the Second World War. It doesn't feel like a sudden crash. It feels far more insidious, like a permanent new reality that you are trapped in. Every single institution that makes money off your transactions is always going to aggressively push the narrative that it is the perfect time to buy, but that simply isn't true. Your frustration is entirely justified. When you look at the raw data, the income required to comfortably afford a median home is roughly $106,000, yet the actual median household income is stuck at $83,700. That means the system has a structural $22,000 gap built into it before you even walk through the front door of an open house. You are not failing at being an adult. The math itself is completely broken. Any decision you make right now must be dictated by your own personal spreadsheet, not some aggressive sales pitch. A good rule of thumb is that if your total monthly housing expenses stay under 30% of your gross income, and you realistically plan to live there for at least 7 to 10 years, purchasing might actually make sense. But if the math does not work, it just doesn't work. Stretching your budget to consume 50% of your paycheck simply because a real estate agent insists it is a historic opportunity does not make it a smart move. It just turns you into a cautionary tale. Honestly, renting a place and investing the leftover cash into a solid index fund is a brilliant, totally valid wealth building strategy. You will rarely hear that advice because nobody collects a massive commission check when you buy index funds. In this era of high prices and high borrowing costs, renting and investing can absolutely beat buying an overpriced property. If you are determined to buy, you should seriously look at new builds. Developers are frequently offering genuine rate buydowns into the 4.5 to 5% range, and surprisingly, new construction prices are currently sitting right on par with older existing homes. Just do your homework to ensure those flashy incentives are not hiding a wildly inflated asking price. You are trying to navigate a landscape created by 30 months of the absolute cheapest money in American history, immediately followed by the most aggressive rate hikes we have seen in 40 years. Layer all of that over a solid decade of underbuilding that left the nation short by 4 million homes, and you get our current mess. Buyers who desperately need prices to drop can't afford the borrowing costs even if they do, and sellers are completely handcuffed by those ultra-low rates from a few years ago. Everyone is essentially trapped at opposite ends of the exact same nightmare. There is no single magic policy, rate cut, or political promise that can fix a structural disaster of this magnitude in just a year. Blindly buying a house and hoping market appreciation will rescue you from a bad deal is a strategy from a bygone era. Running your own numbers isn't being pessimistic. It is the absolute only way to survive a market this heavily distorted. You are not crazy for feeling like the math doesn't add up, because it really doesn't. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell me down in the comments, what is the exact interest rate that would make you feel completely comfortable buying a home right now? See you in the next video, and remember, stay smart with your money. Take care.